It's been some time since we looked at the Protection Ward in Dragonflight beta, and that's probably because it was doing more damage than all the DPSers in the party combined, and that was maybe not by design, and it has received nerfs. And is it still a good spec to main or even play as an alt in Dragonflight beta? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today in today's video about Protection Warrior, Dragonflight beta, and soon to be live since we now know when the expansion is released. And before we go into the video today, consider checking our Patreon page. The link is down below in the description. Our Patreon platform is directly supporting the videos that we do, since we do these videos on a daily basis, and on top of, doing the spec coverages and everything for the Dragonflight beta, we also have the tier lists. We have the podcast on our Mocast channel. We have the Why You Should Main series, which seems like a lot of you people like it, and that's pretty cool because it's really fun to make, and they do take a little bit of time, so we would really be grateful if you considered checking our Patreon page. You can check all the different tiers that you can get. It's all fine. Any basically support is more than appreciated, since it does go a long way into making all of this possible. Thank you, and let's actually check Protection Warrior. And since this is my main, I will always be slightly biased, but it is one of the specs that over the years I have enjoyed playing the most. And even with all the nerfs and the doom and gloom, it's not a bad spec. It's still pretty good. It's likely still the best designed tank in Dragonflight as it is now, which is weird because we haven't really said that about Protection Warrior in a very long time. And although there's the doom and gloomers that, consider Protection to be the worst tank all throughout Shadowlands and so on, it wasn't as bad as people thought, and it can outshine other tanks systematically based because of what it can do. It can outshine other tanks consistently throughout many expansions and many patches. However, talking about what changed, because we have gone through a bunch of iterations for the Warrior talent tree, we're talking about general ones, and although we covered most of them in the Arms and Fury videos, if you haven't watched those, you can go check it out. I'm going to talk very little about what we have right now. First of all, as Protection, you will be starting with Battle and Defensive stance. There's no more Berserker stance. And Frothing Berserker was moved all the way to the left-hand side, and it is one of the nodes that you will definitely want to take. And in its place came Hone Reflexes, reducing the cooldown of Shield Slam and Pummel by 1 second. Not a particularly mandatory node, but you can get it if you want to, while Frothing Berserker remains a very strong requirement to make your Prot Warrior be the best beefy Chad on the battlefield. Revenge having a 20% chance to immediately refund 50% of the rage spent. Really awesome. Just underneath it, you have Pain and Gain. When you take any damage, heal for 4.5% of your maximum health. This can only occur once every 10 seconds. Again, this is slightly debatable. It depends exactly. Probably late game with a lot of gear, this could have a lot more worth to it. And even so, as it stands right now, tanking on the beta, Prot Warrior is pretty tanky. So having this proc is nice because you have more and more sustain and less reliance on your healer. And it's, I think this used to be, instead of Bitter Immunity, which if I'm not mistaken, initially this was a capstone. This is a 3-minute cooldown, restore 20% of health instantly, and remove all diseases, poisons, and curses affecting you. This is an interesting defensive cooldown. It's probably going to be niche situational for places where you would want to remove all of those things on you and get a 20% health. It's on a 3-minute cooldown, so it's not something that you can rely on, considering that its specific mechanics outside of restoring the 20 health are very... If you're in a situation where you're going to be debuffed by so many things, or at least by 1 or 2 of these things consistently, being able to remove them every 3 minutes is not a big deal. But I guess we kind of got used to File of Serenity from Shadowlands, so it's not a bad thing to add to your toolkit if you can spare the talent point, and in most cases you might be able to spare that talent point. Titanic Throw was thrown in the old spot of Pain and Gain, and Titanic Throw is... The weapon throw in general has received a couple of changes here. Titanic Throw is a 6-second cooldown ability that can only be cast from a minimum 8-yard range to a maximum 30-yard range. Throws your weapon at the enemy, causing very minimal attack power and damage. And it hits 5 nearby enemies as well, generating high threat. This is one way where, as a Protection Warrior, you can pull packs of mobs dealing high threat, since we are aware as Protection Warriors how difficult it is to keep threat in AoE when you have blasters like Red Paladin and Arms Warriors, Fury Warriors, Havoc Demon Hunters, all those specs that upfront their damage really quickly. This could be one thing that's really good. It's not going to replace revenge, because obviously if you sorry, not revenge, charge, because obviously if you charge and you cannot use this in because you're too close to the target, but you can live in a world, since revenge is off the GCD, where you can throw and charge. Why do I keep saying revenge? So you can throw Titanic, your Titanic throw, and then charge in, get the benefits of the charge, the rage gain, and so on and so forth, and get some aggro. Couple this with a lot of other stuff. Well, Avatar also got a little bit of nerf to the rage it generates. It now generates 15 down from 20, and it has a choice node. Capstone is the only talent here that you have to choose the capstone of, and that's similar for all 3 warrior specs, which is a neat little thing. You have the Unstoppable Force, which is the old talent that we've been using extensively in BFA and that we kind of like forgot about in Shadowlands since it was particularly nerfed. Now you can take it without having to sacrifice very important other throughput, and it's likely going to be the best option for your avatar. There is an argument for Immovable Object, which is a new upgrade to Avatar, taking the legendary, this is like a really cool design, taking the legendary Tenets of Tormented Kings from Shadowlands and upgrading it to include other types of abilities. So basically activating Avatar or Shield Wall, cast the other one at reduced effectiveness. Now, this is, of course, situational because, first of all, whenever you have Avatar, you kind of want to cast it on cooldown, specifically since it will be reduced by anger management, and so will Shield Wall. They will both be will be having their cooldowns reduced by anger management. Shield Wall is obviously situational. You don't really want to just throw your Shield Wall anytime it's available. You kind of want to time it for its max efficiency. Now, Shield Wall will also give you a damage boost, so you can also take this and be overall more tanky, especially in high rage gain and consuming octane situations. And you might risk wanting to use Shield Wall as a DPS cooldown, which is never really a good concept for a tank, to have a defensive provide you DPS increase, since throughput and DPS in general is something that's important in WoW PvE content, since the content is designed in such a way where the more damage you have, the better the overall result will be, even for a tank, even for a healer, as we've seen with the last couple of years, especially with Mythic Plus. So that's a little bit contentious. However, Unstoppable Force is likely going to be your main pick here. Now, there have been slight nerfs to other stuff like Battle Sense that I mentioned earlier, and only gives you 5% reduction to movement and parrying effects. Barbaric Training also got a 10% damage nerf to the revenge it provided. There's been like nerfs across the board. Spear Bastion generates 20 rage down from 25, and Elysian Might increases its duration by 2 seconds down from the previous 4. And there were some also buffs as well. Piercing Verdict for the upgrade capstone for Elysian Might has had its damage increase to 50% from 30%, and Thunderous Roar has been buffed as well to have its damage around you not in a cone anymore and just around you overall, and generates 10 rage. Not to mention with the capstone, since last we talked about protection, that you can take Thunderous Wards will become also kind of the best option that you can take from this. And last time we discussed that Spear Bastion was so good that is likely you're never going to take Thunderous Roar in this scenario. But with the buffs and with the addition of bleed effects and mechanics that we will talk about in a second, Thunderous Roar is looking to be pretty much pick and forget, especially with the Thunderous Wards capstone upgrade, for a lot of damage and a lot of bleed damage, which is kind of cool. It's a little bit weird still for Protection Warrior, but hey, I mean, you're still a warrior, still cleaving things. It would make sense for the things to bleed. So yeah, the spec talents look kind of the same, with a couple of things moved around and some of the nerfs and some of the buffs making it in. Just to cover like the general side of things. First of all, one thing that you might notice if you're familiar with the old iteration is that Sudden Death was now moved as a choice node with Show of Force, which is a very interesting choice node. It depends exactly how the numbers play out, since right now we're still in the middle of the tuning, so we don't know exactly how the situation will be by the end of the beta cycle. Show of Force has been a conduit in Shadowlands that was very rarely picked. There were some niche situations where you could pick Show of Force as opposed to Sudden Death, where you would probably want this almost all of the time, since it's really good damage and Protection Warrior has really good scaling on its execute. Shield charge doesn't have a minimum rage anymore, which is good. It's kind of like a buff, and you can cast it directly from the boss's face and just charge in and get all the benefits. It still has bugs. For instance, as of today, the bugs that we are aware of, it still consumes a charge of shield block and incurs its cooldown for the shield block, so that's slightly weird. However, you can cast it with no shield block charges. But it is a neat little capstone. It's pretty cool, especially with the new capstone. That's actually the capstone upgrade, rather. I want to call these abilities capstones because we're seeing this theme across a bunch of specs where you have the big ability just a row below the bottom of the talent row, with the bottom of the talent row having big upgrades. Battering Ram is new from last time we visited Prot Warrior. Shield charge, critical strike chance, and critical strike damage increased by 15%, and shield charge increases your auto attack speed by 20% for 20 seconds. That's pretty cool. I mean, it will factor into the Devastator playstyle where attacking faster means more melee damage and more rage generation, which is kind of cool. However, its opposite capstone might actually be upside upgrade might actually be mandatory. Champion's Bulwark. Shield charge deals 20% increased damage, grants you shield block, revenge, and generate an additional 30 rage, which is essentially the reprisal mechanic that made this type of mechanic propel Prot Warrior from actually being a pretty weak tank to being a relevant tank, which was cool, and we've seen that in Shadowlands. Obviously, it's not reprisal, but it is a budget reprisal with maybe more damage up front as user, more burst damage. Probably good to keep things aggroed and have that snap thread that kind of warrior wants every now and again. In the middle of the talent tree where the extra parry chance used to be, now you have Rend as an ability to pick, which I also think that last time we looked at Protection Warrior, Rend was in the general talent tree and that was moved here. Blood Surge is a standalone talent and no longer a choice low, which is pretty good because Blood Surge will become very important to pick, especially with, like I mentioned, Thunderous Roar and Thunderous Words. Especially with Rend and Deep Wounds, you'll have a lot of bleed effects, and these will factor into a lot of rage generation, especially since the general tree, although we haven't talked about it, we mentioned it last time, Blood and Thunder spreading revenge, Rends all over the place will net you, first of all, decent amount of damage, because it kind of was, the playstyle was nerfed a little bit. But with the rage gain from Blood Surge, it will translate into a much faster playstyle, which is what Prot Warrior has always been really good at. And this has kind of always been the crux and the problem with Prot Warrior at the beginning of an expansion is that rage economy was always finicky and basically tanked the tank into the ground until it kind of got fixed. As a choice note with Enduring Training, now we have Massacre, which, I mean, it's kind of an interesting choice because you can pick either between Shield Block having 2 seconds extra duration and Massacre. And this stands to how much defensives you need, because normally the way that the Prot Warrior is designed is that whenever you have Shield Block mechanics, Shield Block upgrades, Shield Block passives and boosts in any way, they're usually pretty overpowered in terms of tankiness, since Shield Block is arguably the best tanking mitigation ability, considering that it's not something ridiculous like 100% parry chance that you just ignore. It's block, it's a reasonable best mitigation ability that it's hard to ever get this nerf, since it's not like, you know, dodge or parry, right? So this will be interesting because I can see, I actually don't mind this because I do live in a world where as a main Prot Warrior, I go into a raid, I get slapped, I would definitely pick Enduring Defense. And once I get more gear, once the raid becomes easier, and I can see this in keys to some extent as well, I would probably go for Massacre, which is more of a single target talent anyway, so it's likely going to affect raids a little bit more, while Enduring Defense is likely going to always be better in Mythic Plus than Massacre. But then again, you can switch around what you want to obtain from the spec, more damage or survive more. So it's cool that we actually have the possibility of choosing between the two, which is nice. Nice. It's very nice. Very nice. Never Surrender was removed. Thank you, since it was pretty bad. We still have it now in Shadowlands, and nobody's ever picking it. It's not as good as it makes it seem, since it's so much ignore pain talk, and we'll get to that once we touch on the tier set as well. Indomitable is now a standalone talent in its place, and it's probably always going to be a pick. It's hard not to ever justify picking Indomitable. For 1 point you get 10% maximum health boost, and for every 10 rage you spend, you heal 1% of your maximum HP, which is very good, which is something that, you know, can kind of invalidate the previous pain and gain that we talked about in the general talent tree, since with the Blood Surge talent, you're going to generate so much rage and you're going to spend so much rage that Indomitable is a very good source of maintaining some sustain. Violent Outburst, basically the Outburst Searsa mechanic that we have right now in Shadowlands is slightly on the right-hand side of Indomitable. Consuming 30 rage grants a stack of Seeing Red, which transforms at 8 stacks into Violent Outburst, causing your next Shield Slam or Thunderclap to be 200% more effective and grant Ignore Pain, which is amazing. I love this Searsa that we have right now. It's one of the main reasons why I decided to main Prot Warrior in 9.2 and moving forward. And Booming Voice is also down here. Previously, I think it was way over the top, just below Demoralizing Shout. Booming Voice is really cool because you always had to choose between this and Burst Circle in the last couple of expansions. Now you can actually have both, and Booming Voice is such a good ability for Protection Warrior to transform your Demoralizing Shout from a damage reduction ability to a damage reduction ability plus a rage gain plus a damage increase ability, where because Booming Voice still makes Demo Shout generate 40 rage and increase the damage you deal to affected targets by Demo Shout by 20%, which is a big boost in damage. It's kind of how Protection Warrior gets its damage out. And on the right-hand side, you have Brutal Vitality as a choice node with Fueled by Violence, which, first of all, it's a good choice node because both of these are, in my opinion, turbo bad. They're very bad sustainabilities. Brutal ability sounds amazing because 30% of the damage you deal as your active Ignore Pain. However, we can talk about this in two different situations. First of all, the first situation would be the situation where you would have Ignore Pain up on you enough time for that Brutal Vitality to actually go into the shield and extend it, at which point you're capping Ignore Pain, since you would have a lot of rage generation, not to mention you have Violent Outbursts, which you should probably be playing 100% of the time when you're playing Prot Warrior, meaning that you're likely going to be in a situation like we have right now in Shadowlands where you're over-generating rage, so you're over-capping Ignore Pain to prevent your rage cap, since it's better to cap on Ignore Pain, which still caps at 30% of your max health, and instead of capping rage. So it's kind of inconsequential, Brutal Vitality that is, since it won't work in that situation, it's a waste of a point. On the other side of the coin is when you tank difficult content, when you're progressing, when your Ignore Pain is basically being eaten by almost every attack, meaning that you don't really realistically have time to fuel an Ignore Pain, although it might have, on paper, it might sound like it have more value here, but considering that, what is this? 30% of damage you deal goes into your active Ignore Pain, so if you already live in a world where your Ignore Pain can be eaten in 1 or 2 seconds, 30% of the damage you deal being put into Ignore Pain is not going to be nearly enough to facilitate a proper uptime on Ignore Pain, considering that if we're going to talk about numbers, the amount of effective HP that Ignore Pain provides as in contrast to 30% of your DPS is not going to be nowhere near enough to be justified. Fueled by Violence is likely what you're going to be taking. You are healed by 50% of damage dealt by Deep Wounds. Deep Wounds ideally should never be a big damage source for Protection Warrior, aka this particular mechanic is never going to be really good for Protection Warrior, although you do have a lot of bleed synergies, so maybe that can make Fueled by Violence be a little bit better, considering that, like I mentioned, Thunderous Words from the General Talent tree increases the duration of the bleed effect from the, keep wanting to say Dragon's Roar, but it's Thunderous Roar, and increase the damage of your other bleed effects by 20% at all times. So obviously Fueled by Violence has a little bit more value here, since with the Thunderous Words capstone you can get more damage, more damage, but also more healing through this particular talent. Spell Block was moved as a choice node with Tough as Nails, which I guess that makes more sense. Spell Block was basically way down on the middle side of the talent tree. It was kind of like a capstone, was really powerful. 1.5 minute cooldown, you are able to block all spells for 20 seconds. Wow. It's mostly direct damage spells, but still is pretty good, especially in situations. It's niche, it's a niche pick, and it's good that as a niche pick, you can actually choose to go Tough as Nails, which blocking an attack deals physical damage to the attacker, ignoring armor, and generates high threat. This I think is Spiked Shield renamed into Tough as Nails, which is not that bad. It's likely that you're going to be taking Tough as Nails when you're probably tanking AoE as opposed to Spell Block, although you might actually skip this entirely You might take stuff like maybe Bloodborne, Deep Wounds, Rend, and Thunderous Roars. Bleed effects deal 15% increased damage. Again, coupled with what I mentioned earlier, it stacks this bleed damage, which it's cool. It's cool to have this playstyle. It reminds me of Arms Warrior in BFA, where like 70-80% of Arms Warrior damage was Deep Wounds. And it's weird because it was a dot spec instead of a melee big swing spec. So I'm hoping that Pro Warrior doesn't turn into this, although it is interesting to have bleed effects that can be relatively relevant. And finally, a new capstone came to Ravager, and we are talking about Dance of Death, which is what the other two warrior specs have as well. Your Ravager helps, if your Ravager helps kill an enemy, your next Ravager lasts 2 seconds longer and deals 20% increased damage, which is what we're seeing with stuff like Bladestorm for the other two specs. And you still have the other one, Storm of Steel, which I think it was also buffed, because I did mention this in previous warrior videos. Ravager damage is reduced by 40% instead of 50%, but it now has 2 charges and generates 15 rage each time it deals damage. If I recall, last time I looked at Storm of Steel, it dealt 50% less damage and it didn't generate any rage. Granted, I was looking at Fury and Arms, but either way, if you're going to improve an ability, you're not going to slice it in half in terms of its damage and add another charge and just basically make it the same. You just have more mini casts of it. It's an actual improvement. Whether or not you're going to end up taking it remains to be seen, because Dance of Death is clearly superior in terms of AoE. And talking about the tier set, the 2-set bonus basically makes Revenge grant you Vanguard's Determination, increasing your damage and reducing the damage that you take by 4% for 5 seconds. This is again in a world where you could spam Revenge, if that ever turns out to be the case, to be very okay, rather. It's good, but we're taking away the Reprisal Legendary, which made Prot Warrior be able to do a lot of revenges in its rotation, which a lot of people might forget that prior to the Reprisal Legendary and the mechanic in Shadowlands, you didn't used to press a lot of revenges. You pressed it occasionally, especially in AoE, but it was always a choice between pressing that or Shield Block or Ignore Pain, rather, depends on the rage generation. However, with the increase of rage generation, it's likely that we will be pressing Revenge a little bit more. While the 4-set bonus during Vanguard's Determination, these little 5 seconds of buff, you gain Ignore Pain equal to 10% of the damage you deal, which goes back to Brutal Vitality that we discussed earlier. Again, there's a finite cap to Ignore Pain on how much it can be. If they remove that cap, maybe all of these Ignore Pain sounds could be good. I don't know why they keep adding Ignore Pain mechanics while actually ignoring the basic issue with the ability in and of itself, because I trash Ignore Pain a lot because it isn't what it's at least marketed to be, and it has some glaring issues that when you see all of these buffs, you think, oh, that's so good, but because of those issues, it's never going to be as amazing. And instead of getting some cool upgrades to like some cool abilities that we actually use and get a lot out of, we're getting constantly Ignore Pain stuff, which I don't know, maybe increase the cap of Ignore Pain to 50% of your HP, which is still, it's arguably, it's debatable if it's going to be good or bad, but after the buffs that we got to Ignore Pain into 9.2, where it reduced the rage cost of the ability, and the cap, I mean, I don't know, we'll see. I guess we will see exactly how it is, and increase the cap of Absorb to 55% from 50%. I remember this. Remains to be seen exactly. On paper, it sounds good, but you're wasting a lot of Ignore Pain a lot of the time anyway, so we'll see. The tier set overall, as with the current numbers right now, is very underwhelming. You maybe get about 4% extra damage and 4 to 5% defensives in terms of damage mitigation, while the 4-piece is basically like free mechanics. It's not amazing, it sounds cool on paper, but it's very underwhelming. Definitely way underwhelming considering to what we have right now in Shadowlands. But that's it about Protection Warrior. There's been some neat changes. We did expect a lot of nerfs, and a lot of people were worried about the nerfs. I am here to tell you that you don't need to be worried about. Play Protection Warrior. It's looking like a really good tank. It's probably the best tank. I'm not saying that because it's overpowered. I'm kind of saying that because a lot of the tanks are very underwhelming at this point, which is a stark contrast to the discussion that we had last time, where tanks all looked really well, but they're not. We talked about Protection Warrior. Bear is also like full of bugs and it doesn't work properly. Brewmaster is pretty much the same, and Blood Decay is slightly better than pre-tier set Blood Decay. But the only real tank that seems like it got new talent and it seems like it's going to be a fresh spec into a new expansion is Protection Warrior. So if you do decide to main it, you're probably making the right choice. But thank you for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Patrons, for supporting the content. Once again, the link to our Patreon page is down below, and you can check it if you want to support this content a little bit more. We would be super grateful. See you next time. Love y'all. Bye-bye. Peace.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.